The morning routine. Darius Durant, a dedicated young postman, cherished the quiet, predictable routine of his mornings. Every day began in much the same way. Alarm clock ringing at the crack of dawn, a splash of cold water on his face, and the smooth fabric of his postal uniform as he carefully buttoned it up. This morning was no different. He stood in front of his mirror, straightening his collar, the embroidered eagle emblem over his chest, a badge of honor he wore proudly. Darius loved his job, not just for the reliable paycheck, but for the connections he built with the people along his route. Each house, each face, each interaction was like a stitch in the fabric of his life. Darius's route was a mix of familiar streets and familiar faces in Copper Hill. Early risers with coffee mugs in hand would wave from their porches, dog walkers would nod in friendly acknowledgement, and kids waiting for school buses would greet him with bright smiles. As Darius moved through his route, he appreciated these fleeting connections, feeling a sense of purpose in delivering not just letters and packages, but also moments of community warmth. When he arrived at the post office that morning, he sorted through his deliveries and came across a small package addressed to Mrs. Jane Thompson. Her name brought a gentle smile to his face. Mrs. Thompson was a favorite along his route, known for her kindness and warmth. A woman of 75, she had lived in her quaint home on Elm Street for as long as Darius could remember, filling her yard with blossoming flowers and her porch with neatly arranged potted plants. She would greet him with stories from her youth, offering small homemade treats and brightening his day with her cheerful spirit. It had been a while since he'd seen her, and he looked forward to their usual chat. As he drove to Elm Street, Darius noticed something odd. Mrs. Thompson's yard, usually meticulously maintained, looked slightly overgrown. A few weeds peeked out from her flower beds, and the grass had grown past its usual trim length. Though a small detail, it caught his eye because it was so unlike her. When he reached her front door, he spotted another unsettling sign. A small stack of newspapers sat on her doorstep, a few edges yellowed from exposure to the elements. Darius knocked on her door, then rang the doorbell, waiting patiently for the shuffling footsteps he usually heard before she answered. Minutes ticked by in silence, and Darius's heart grew heavy with worry. He knocked again, this time harder, calling out her name, but still no response. Glancing at her mailbox, he saw it was stuffed to overflowing, an unusual sight for a woman who always stayed on top of her mail. Trying to reason with himself, he thought perhaps she had gone to visit family or was simply under the weather. But Mrs. Thompson's absence, combined with the neglected state of her home, left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. Just as he turned to leave, Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, appeared, watering his roses with a cautious eye on Darius. The two exchanged greetings, and Darius took the opportunity to inquire about Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Jenkins paused, looking troubled as he thought. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her in a couple of weeks," he said, his face clouded with concern. "She used to be out every morning, tending to her garden. But lately, it's been quiet over there." Darius's stomach twisted in response. 2 weeks was a long time. He thanked Mr. Jenkins and returned to his van, his mind racing. Though the morning sun warmed his shoulders, a chill lingered in his bones as he tried to move on with his route. But each house, each delivery, each face blurred as his mind circled back to Mrs. Thompson's house, wondering if there was more he should have done. As the morning wore on, Darius struggled to shake the image of her quiet home and overflowing mailbox. By the time he reached his lunch break, he decided to swing by her house once more. This time, he told himself, he wouldn't just knock and leave if there was no answer. A worrying discovery. Darius couldn't ignore the nagging feeling tugging at his heart as he made his way back to Mrs. Thompson's house. His usual lunch at Mabel's diner would have to wait. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to let it go. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing with possible explanations. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was simply feeling under the weather and needed a hand with her garden. Maybe she had gone to stay with a relative. But deep down, he sensed it was something more, something that warranted attention. As he pulled up to her house, Darius took in the quiet neighborhood. Elm Street was lined with tidy homes, each one bearing the marks of longtime residents who took pride in their properties. But Mrs. Thompson's house was different today. The small details he had noticed earlier, the uncollected mail, the pile of newspapers, the overgrown yard, now seemed more troubling. As he stepped out of his van, he took a deep breath, bracing himself for what he might find. This time, he approached the door with more determination. Darius rang the doorbell and waited, his ears straining for the familiar sound of shuffling feet or the creak of the door. He knocked again, louder, calling her name as he did. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Darius, your mailman. Are you home?" Silence greeted him, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the gentle summer breeze. Darius's concern grew sharper, a mixture of worry and dread creeping up his spine. He took a step back, glancing around the yard, looking for any other signs that something was amiss. His eyes landed on the small window to the left of the door, and he leaned in for a closer look, shading his eyes with his hand as he peered inside. Through the dusty glass, he could barely make out the interior of the living room. What he saw stopped him cold. The once tidy room looked disheveled. Furniture was slightly out of place, and a few items were scattered across the floor, a sight that seemed completely unlike Mrs. Thompson. An unsettling thought occurred to him. What if she was in trouble, trapped or hurt, unable to call for help? Darius's mind raced through his options. He couldn't just walk away. Driven by concern, he decided to try one last thing. He walked around the side of the house, checking to see if any windows were open. Mrs. Thompson had once mentioned to him that she often left a small kitchen window cracked for her cat, Mittens, who enjoyed sitting on the windowsill to watch the birds. As he approached the vac, he was relieved to find the window slightly ajar. The kitchen window was small, just big enough for him to squeeze through if he was careful. He took a quick glance around the backyard, hoping to avoid any alarm from neighbors who might see him climbing through a window. Then, with a deep breath, he hoisted himself up and eased his way inside. Once in the kitchen, Darius took a moment to steady himself, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. The air felt heavy, with a faint, unpleasant smell lingering in the room. He looked around, noting the cluttered countertops and dishes piled in the sink. Another unusual sign. Mrs. Thompson was known for keeping a spotless home, and the sight of dirty dishes seemed out of place. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart hammered in his chest as he stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight. The house was eerily silent, every small noise echoing in the stillness. As he made his way further into the house, he noticed more signs of neglect, a stack of unopened letters on a side table, a layer of dust settling on surfaces, and the distinct smell of stale air that suggested the windows hadn't been opened in days. His worry deepened, and he quickened his pace, moving from room to room in search of her. When he reached the living room, he felt his stomach twist. There, slumped in a worn armchair by the window, was Mrs. Thompson. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, her silver hair matted, and her clothes wrinkled and stained. She looked as if she hadn't moved from the chair in days, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and labored. "Mrs. Thompson," he called softly, his voice filled with worry. She stirred at the sound of her name, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze was unfocused, and it took a moment for her to recognize him. "Darius," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She tried to sit up, but the effort seemed to exhaust her, and she sank back into the chair. Darius knelt beside her, his heart breaking at the sight. This was not the vibrant, kind woman he remembered. She looked fragile, weakened by some unknown force that had left her a shadow of her former self. "What happened, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked gently, reaching out to take her hand. It felt cold and frail in his grip, and he noticed a faint tremor as she attempted to speak. I don't know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I haven't been feeling well. Everything seems so difficult lately." As she spoke, Darius glanced around the room, noting more unsettling details. A half-eaten meal sat forgotten on a tray nearby, and her medicine bottles were scattered across the coffee table, some of them open, others still full. It was clear that she had been struggling, likely too weak to care for herself properly. Darius's mind raced, trying to think of what to do. He couldn't leave her here alone, not in this state. Her frailty and confusion worried him deeply, and he knew she needed help beyond what he could provide. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing 911. As he spoke to the operator, he kept a reassuring hold on Mrs. Thompson's hand, telling her softly that help was on the way. The dispatcher promised to send an ambulance and asked him to stay with her until it arrived. In those moments, Darius felt a deep sense of responsibility for the elderly woman beside him. She had no family nearby, no close friends who checked in on her regularly, and without his persistence, she might have continued to suffer in silence. The thought chilled him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on providing comfort until help arrived. "Just hold on, Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, giving her hand a comforting squeeze. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming." As they waited, he stayed by her side, speaking softly to keep her calm. Feeling the weight of his discovery settle heavily on his shoulders. He had only expected to deliver a package that day, but instead, he had found a woman in need, someone who had been left unseen, her suffering unnoticed until now. And as he sat beside her, he couldn't help but think of all the other elderly people on his route, the ones who might also be struggling behind closed doors, hidden from view. When the ambulance finally arrived, Darius helped the paramedics as they gently lifted Mrs. Thompson onto a stretcher. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness as he watched them carry her out of the house, knowing she was finally getting the help she needed, but troubled by the thought of how long she had suffered in silence. As the ambulance pulled away, he stood alone on the porch, the weight of the morning's events pressing heavily on him. Darius made a silent vow to himself as he watched the ambulance disappear down the street. He would pay closer attention to the people on his route, especially those who might be vulnerable or alone. Today, he had made a difference for Mrs. Thompson, but he knew there were others who might also need a lifeline. With a renewed sense of purpose, he climbed back into his van, ready to continue his route, his mind and heart forever changed by what he had seen. A community's concern. The afternoon sun cast a soft glow over Copper Hill as Darius resumed his route, his thoughts still lingering on Mrs. Thompson. Although he tried to focus on the task at hand, images of her fragile form haunted him, accompanied by a newfound sense of responsibility he had not anticipated. Delivering mail was one thing, but watching over the well-being of his community was something entirely different. Yet, as he drove through the familiar streets, he realized how much this town meant to him, how every interaction had woven him into the fabric of these lives. Copper Hill wasn't just a place on a map, it was a community, and today he had felt that bond more deeply than ever before. Darius finished his deliveries in a quiet daze, replaying the events of the day in his mind. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in his ears. Everything seems so difficult lately. He wondered if anyone else had noticed the subtle changes in her, or if he'd been the only one paying attention. He recalled moments over the past year where she'd appeared slightly more withdrawn, her usual vibrant spirit slightly dimmer. But he had brushed it off, assuming it was just a natural part of aging. By the time he returned to the post office, he couldn't resist sharing what had happened with his colleagues. As he unloaded his van, a few coworkers gathered around, sensing that something was on his mind. "Hey Darius, you look like you've seen a ghost," his friend Tony remarked, eyebrows raised in concern. Tony was a seasoned postal worker, a stout man with a kind face and a soft spot for neighborhood gossip. He had seen it all on his route, from kids' lemonade stands to backyard family feuds, and he was always eager to lend a hand when needed. Darius took a deep breath, recounting the story of his visit to Mrs. Thompson's home, his voice laced with a blend of worry and relief. He explained how he'd found her, the state of her home, and how he had called 911 for help. "That poor woman," muttered Sandra, another postal worker who had been in Copper Hill nearly as long as Tony. Her gaze softened, and she crossed her arms tightly, as if absorbing the weight of the story. "Jane Thompson has been in this town longer than any of us. Her husband was a respected teacher before he passed, and she's lived in that house for over 40 years. I can't believe no one knew she was struggling." The small group of coworkers fell silent, each lost in thought. They all had elderly residents on their routes, and Darius's story struck a nerve, reminding them that their role extended beyond mail delivery. They were witnesses to the lives of the people they served, with the unique ability to spot subtle changes that others might miss. After a thoughtful pause, Sandra looked at Darius with a determined expression. "We should do something about this, you know. It's not just Mrs. Thompson. There are plenty of others in this town who might be going through the same thing, hidden behind closed doors." Tony nodded, scratching his chin. "I agree. Maybe we could organize something, like a check-in system or a volunteer group that helps out seniors. The town council used to have something like that, but funding was cut years ago. Maybe we could start it up again." Darius felt a surge of hope as they discussed the idea, knowing that together they could make a difference. His experience with Mrs. Thompson had opened his eyes, and he realized it wasn't enough to simply move on after that day. This was a chance to create lasting change in the community, to ensure that no one else would suffer in silence. Over the next few days, Darius poured his energy into creating a plan. With the help of Tony, Sandra, and a few other colleagues, he reached out to local organizations, churches, and community centers, hoping to rally support for a new initiative. They called it Neighbors in Need, a program that aimed to provide regular check-ins and assistance for elderly residents in Copper Hill. They organized a meeting at the local library, spreading the word through flyers, social media, and even adding notes to their mail deliveries, inviting everyone in town to join them. When the day of the meeting arrived, Darius was surprised by the turnout. Dozens of residents gathered in the library's community room, filling every chair and spilling into the aisles. Young and old, men and women, all had come to show their support. He spotted some familiar faces from his route: parents with their children, retirees, even local business owners. The room buzzed with a sense of anticipation, and Darius felt a mix of nerves and excitement as he prepared to speak. Standing at the front of the room, he cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd, feeling the weight of his responsibility. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "As some of you might know, I'm Darius, your friendly neighborhood mailman." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, and he smiled, feeling a bit more at ease. "Recently, I had an experience that changed the way I see this town," he continued, recounting the story of Mrs. Thompson's decline and how he had found her. "It made me realize that sometimes people are struggling right in front of us, and we don't see it until it's too late. Mrs. Thompson is getting the help she needs now, but I can't help but wonder, what about others who don't have anyone looking out for them?" Darius paused, letting his words sink in, and noticed several people nodding in agreement. He took a breath and continued, "That's why we're here tonight. Together, I believe we can make sure that our neighbors don't slip through the cracks. We're proposing a program called Neighbors in Need, where we'll have volunteers from the community checking in on our elderly residents, offering help when needed, and just being there as a friend and support system." The crowd erupted in applause, and Darius felt a swell of pride and gratitude. As he opened the floor to questions and suggestions, he was moved by the response. People volunteered to help with various tasks. Some offered to organize grocery deliveries. Others volunteered to make regular calls to elderly residents, and a few healthcare professionals even offered to provide wellness checks. One woman in the back raised her hand, and when Darius called on her, she introduced herself as Maggie, a retired nurse who had lived in Copper Hill her whole life. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said warmly. But I'd also suggest we establish a small emergency fund for those who might need medications or household repairs, things they can't afford on a fixed income. Darius nodded, grateful for her insight. Thank you, Maggie. That's a great idea. We'll make it happen. By the end of the evening, the town had come together with a unified purpose. They had organized committees, assigned tasks, and created a network of support that extended across Copper Hill. Darius felt a profound sense of accomplishment as he looked around the room, realizing that what had started as a moment of concern for one woman had blossomed into something much larger, a movement of care and compassion that would make a lasting impact. As the meeting wrapped up, Darius noticed a familiar face making her way through the crowd toward him. It was Mrs. Thompson's neighbor, Mr. Jenkins. The older man gave Darius a firm handshake, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did good, son," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice thick with emotion. "If it hadn't been for you, who knows what might have happened to Jane. I'm proud to be a part of this." Darius thanked him, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected his small act of kindness to spark such a response, but seeing the community come together filled him with hope. As he left the library that night, Darius walked through the quiet streets of Copper Hill, his steps lighter than they had been in days. He knew that the town was different now, bound by a shared commitment to watch over one another. And as he passed by Mrs. Thompson's house, he noticed a light on in her front window, a small, comforting sign that she was safe and recovering, her home no longer shrouded in silence. Darius felt a sense of peace as he continued down the road, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that he had the strength of an entire community behind him. Mrs. Thompson's return home. The weeks passed, and Copper Hill began to settle into a new rhythm. Neighbors in need took root quickly, with volunteers conducting regular check-ins, organizing grocery runs, and lending a helping hand to anyone who needed it. The town's elderly residents, many of whom had been leading quiet, isolated lives, found themselves surrounded by warmth and support, grateful for the sense of community that had blossomed around them. Darius continued his rounds, now with a heightened awareness of the people he served. Each stop along his route felt more significant, each face he encountered more precious. He had become not just the neighborhood mailman, but a symbol of compassion and care. People waved to him with a new level of familiarity, greeting him as if he were family. To them, he was more than just a postal worker. He was a friend, a guardian, and a reminder that no one in Copper Hill was truly alone. One bright morning, as Darius began his route, he received news that made his heart soar. Mrs. Thompson had been discharged from the hospital and was due to return home that day. Her brief stay in a rehabilitation center had strengthened her, thanks to the medical care and attention she needed. The hospital had coordinated with neighbors in need to ensure she would have groceries, medical supplies, and regular visits. Darius was thrilled, eager to see her again and witness firsthand how far she had come. After finishing his deliveries for the day, Darius made a quick stop at Mabel's diner. He picked up a small box of Mrs. Thompson's favorite lemon tea biscuits, a gesture he knew she would appreciate. As he drove toward her home, he felt a mix of emotions, happiness, relief, and a lingering sense of guilt that he hadn't noticed her struggle sooner. Yet he reminded himself that, thanks to his actions, she had received help just in time. When he arrived, Darius was surprised to see a few neighbors gathered in her yard, busying themselves with preparations for her arrival. Mr. Jenkins, her next-door neighbor, was trimming the bushes, while Maggie, the retired nurse who had joined neighbors in need, swept the porch with careful precision. The sight filled Darius with pride, a reminder of the powerful unity the community had embraced. Maggie looked up as Darius approached, her face breaking into a warm smile. "You're just in time, Darius," she said. "We wanted to make sure everything was perfect for Mrs. Thompson. She deserves to come home to a place that's as welcoming as she is." Darius nodded, touched by the gesture. "She'll be so happy to see everyone here. It means the world to her." He joined in, helping to tidy the flower beds and arrange the welcome banner they had crafted with bright, cheerful letters spelling out "Welcome home, Mrs. Thompson." The preparations continued for a while longer, and as the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the house, a taxi pulled up in front, and everyone fell silent, eagerly awaiting the familiar figure. Mrs. Thompson stepped out slowly, aided by the driver, her once frail frame appearing stronger, though she still moved with a cautious grace. Her silver hair was neatly brushed, and she wore a light cardigan and a warm smile that filled her entire face. When she looked up and saw the small crowd gathered on her lawn, her eyes widened with surprise, and tears glistened at the corners. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, clutching her chest as she took in the scene. "All of you, you came here just for me." Maggie stepped forward, taking Mrs. Thompson's hand gently. "Welcome home, Jane. We've all missed you." The small crowd murmured in agreement, and Darius felt his heart swell as he watched the elderly woman's reaction. She blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the love and care she saw in the eyes of her neighbors. Darius approached her, holding out the box of lemon tea biscuits with a smile. "I thought you might like a little treat to celebrate your return." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, her voice soft yet full of joy. "You remembered," she said, looking at him with gratitude. She took the box from him, patting his hand with a trembling but steady touch. "Thank you, Darius. I don't know what I would have done without you." For a moment, they stood in silence, a wordless understanding passing between them. Mrs. Thompson had always been a fixture on Darius's route, but now he felt a deeper connection, a responsibility and affection that transcended his role as her mailman. She was family, part of the community he had vowed to protect. As they guided her inside, Darius was struck by the warmth that filled the house. Neighbors had helped clean, arranged fresh flowers on the dining table, and filled the pantry with essentials. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about the love Copper Hill held for Mrs. Thompson, and she took it all in, her eyes lingering on each thoughtful detail. Once settled in her favorite armchair, Mrs. Thompson looked around, her gaze softening as she took in the familiar surroundings. She seemed more at peace, her shoulders relaxing as if the weight of solitude had finally been lifted. "I can't tell you how much this means to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so afraid of being alone, of becoming invisible. But seeing all of you here, knowing I'm surrounded by such kindness, it's more than I ever could have hoped for." Darius sat across from her, nodding as he listened. "You're not alone, Mrs. Thompson. None of us are. We're all in this together now." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and he felt a sense of pride and purpose unlike anything he had ever known. For years he had driven through these streets, delivering letters, packages, and the occasional smile, but now he understood the true power of his role. He wasn't just delivering mail, he was delivering connection, compassion, and a sense of belonging. The afternoon passed in laughter and shared stories, with neighbors drifting in and out, each one taking a moment to welcome Mrs. Thompson back home. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a warm glow over the room, Darius realized that this day marked a turning point, not just for Mrs. Thompson, but for all of Copper Hill. After most of the neighbors had departed, Maggie approached Darius in the hallway. "You know, I was talking to the town council," she said quietly, her voice tinged with excitement. "They're interested in making Neighbors in Need an official program. They see the impact it's had already, and they want to support it long-term. We're even thinking about expanding it to neighboring towns." Darius felt a surge of pride and disbelief. What had started as a small effort to help one person had transformed into something much bigger, a movement that could change lives far beyond Copper Hill. "That's incredible, Maggie," he replied, shaking his head in amazement. "I never imagined it would go this far." Maggie nodded, smiling. "It's all because of you, Darius. You were the one who noticed. You were the one who cared enough to act. Don't ever forget that." He glanced back at Mrs. Thompson, who sat in her armchair, the box of lemon tea biscuits resting on her lap as she sipped a cup of tea, her face peaceful and content. Darius realized that Maggie was right. One small act of kindness had set off a ripple, spreading through the community and beyond, a testament to the power of caring, even in the quietest moments. As he left Mrs. Thompson's house that evening, Darius felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose that went beyond anything he had ever known. He understood, in that moment, that he was not just a mailman. He was part of something much larger, a thread in the tapestry of Copper Hill, a town bound together by love, compassion, and the promise that no one would be left behind. And as he walked back to his van, he looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the evening sky, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there were many more neighbors in need, and that he would be there for them, just as he had been for Mrs. Thompson. The ripple effect. In the weeks following Mrs. Thompson's return home, neighbors in need blossomed into something more profound and expansive than anyone in Copper Hill could have anticipated. What had begun as a heartfelt effort to help one elderly woman quickly became a beacon of unity, drawing people from all corners of town. Every resident seemed to feel a newfound sense of purpose, eager to contribute in any way they could. Grocery store clerks, librarians, local business owners, and high school students, everyone wanted to be involved, to extend a hand in strengthening the community they called home. Darius was now something of a local hero, though he didn't see himself that way. To him, he was still just Darius, the mailman doing his rounds. But to the townspeople, he had become a symbol of compassion, proof that one person could truly make a difference. He found himself at the center of a community transformation, where people sought him out for advice, ideas, and encouragement. The residents of Copper Hill looked to him with admiration, their gratitude evident in every nod, every smile, and every word of thanks. One Saturday morning, as Darius prepared to start his route, he received an unexpected phone call from Maggie, the retired nurse who had been instrumental in helping launch Neighbors in Need. Maggie sounded excited, her voice buzzing with anticipation. "Darius, I think you need to come to the town hall today," she said. "There's something special you need to see. A few members of the town council are meeting there, and, well, I think you'll want to be a part of it." Intrigued, Darius agreed, making a quick detour to the town hall before starting his deliveries. The town hall was a modest brick building, its walls lined with old portraits and photographs depicting the history of Copper Hill. As he entered, he noticed a small group of people gathered near the council chamber, a mix of town officials, community members, and volunteers from Neighbors in Need. Maggie spotted him and waved him over with a smile, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "There he is, the man of the hour," she exclaimed, drawing curious glances from the crowd. Darius blushed, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention, but he managed a grateful smile. "What's going on?" he asked, looking around at the expectant faces surrounding him. Just then, Councilman Gregor, a tall, gray-haired man with a deep voice and a warm demeanor, stepped forward. He shook Darius's hand firmly, his gaze full of appreciation. "Darius, it's good to see you," Gregor began. "Thanks to your efforts, Neighbors in Need has grown beyond anything we could have imagined. We've seen the positive impact it's had on our elderly residents and on the community as a whole. It's truly inspiring." He paused, nodding to Maggie, who handed him a piece of paper. Gregor continued, "The council has decided to take Neighbors in Need to the next level. We're officially designating it as a funded town-sponsored program, complete with resources, a budget, and even a permanent coordinator to oversee its operations, and we'd like to offer that role to you, Darius, if you're interested." A hush fell over the room as everyone looked at Darius, waiting for his reaction. He blinked, struggling to absorb the enormity of what he had just heard. A paid position overseeing Neighbors in Need. He had never imagined something like this, especially not for himself. His job as a mailman was all he had known for years, and he was content with it. But as he looked around the room, At the faces of people he had grown to care for, he realized that this new role could allow him to make a lasting difference. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he looked at Councilman Gregor. I don't know what to say. I'm honored, truly, but I've never thought of myself as someone who leads. I'm just a mailman. You're much more than that, Darius, Maggie said, her voice steady and filled with warmth. You're the reason we're all here. You've already shown us what it means to care, to act, and to make a change. Think of this role as an extension of what you've already been doing. Darius glanced around the room, seeing nods of encouragement from those gathered. The townspeople's expressions were hopeful, their eyes shining with belief in him. He felt a wave of emotions wash over him: gratitude, responsibility, and a deep, abiding love for this community that had become his family. With a steadying breath, Darius nodded. I would be honored to take on the role, he said, his voice firm. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing through the chamber as Darius felt the weight of his decision settle over him. He was no longer just the mailman. He was now the leader of an initiative that would shape the future of Copper Hill. The following week marked the beginning of a new chapter. Darius transitioned into his role as the coordinator of Neighbors in Need, and he threw himself into the work with dedication and passion. He spent hours developing programs, organizing volunteers, and meeting with local organizations to strengthen their resources. His vision for Neighbors in Need extended far beyond Copper Hill. He dreamed of expanding the program to nearby towns, creating a network of support that would stretch across the county. One of the first initiatives he implemented was a check-in day. Once a week, volunteers would visit or call elderly residents, offering not only help with errands, but also companionship and conversation. Darius knew firsthand how powerful these simple acts could be, having seen the effect they had on Mrs. Thompson and others like her. As the program grew, Darius began to receive messages from neighboring towns, people eager to learn how they could replicate Neighbors in Need in their own communities. The program was starting to make headlines in local newspapers, and soon, a reporter from a major state newspaper contacted Darius, requesting an interview. The day of the interview arrived, and Darius found himself sitting across from a young reporter named Jess, who had traveled from the state capital to meet him. Jess was enthusiastic, her notepad and recorder at the ready as she leaned forward, eager to hear his story. So Darius, she began, smiling warmly. Tell me, how did all this start? Darius paused, his thoughts drifting back to that fateful day when he had discovered Mrs. Thompson in her home, alone and in need. He recounted the story, his words, a legacy of kindness. Months passed, and Neighbors in Need had become a cornerstone of Copper Hill, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that Darius could never have anticipated. The impact rippled far beyond the town's borders, touching lives in neighboring communities and inspiring similar programs across the state. From the very first check-in day to organizing volunteers who helped with household repairs, grocery shopping, and medical checkups, Darius watched with pride as the program flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and connection. The program's success attracted more attention than Darius could have imagined. Invitations to speak at community events poured in, and organizations from across the region reached out, asking for guidance in replicating Neighbors in Need in their own areas. Though slightly shy and unaccustomed to the spotlight, Darius accepted each opportunity, driven by his desire to spread the message that kindness and vigilance could transform lives. One afternoon, as he wrapped up a talk at a community center in a nearby town, Darius received an unexpected phone call from Councilman Gregor. His voice was warm, but carried a tone of seriousness that immediately put Darius on alert. Darius, Gregor began, I'd just been on a call with the governor's office. They want to recognize you and Neighbors in Need with an award for community leadership and service. There will be a ceremony at the state capitol, and we'd love for you to represent Copper Hill. Stunned, Darius didn't know how to respond at first. The thought of standing before a crowd in the grand state capitol building was intimidating, but the opportunity to shine a light on the importance of community care was something he couldn't pass up. The day of the ceremony arrived quickly, and Darius made his way to the Capitol, dressed in a simple navy blue suit that felt both foreign and strangely fitting. As he entered the Grand Hall, he took in the ornate columns, polished marble floors, and high arching ceilings. He felt both awe and disbelief. All of this, he thought, because he'd taken a moment to notice the details, to act on a feeling that something wasn't right in Mrs. Thompson's home. As he approached the podium, he saw familiar faces in the audience, his Copper Hill neighbors, Maggie, Tony, Sandra, and of course, Mrs. Thompson herself, seated in the front row. Seeing her there, with a proud smile and misty eyes, gave him the courage he needed to speak. Darius cleared his throat, taking a deep breath as he began. "Thank you all for this incredible honor. Standing here, I'm reminded that sometimes the smallest gestures can make the biggest impact. I'm here because of one moment, one decision to reach out, and that decision led to Neighbors in Need, a program that has shown me just how much we need one another." He glanced down at Mrs. Thompson, whose quiet strength and resilience had inspired so much of what he had accomplished. This journey started with a knock on Mrs. Thompson's door, but it's grown into something much larger than any of us could have imagined. I used to think my role as a mailman was just about delivering letters and packages. But now I see that my job, and each of our jobs, is about delivering connection, showing up for one another, and creating the community where no one is invisible. The audience erupted into applause, and Darius felt a rush of gratitude as he returned to his seat, feeling both humbled and proud. When the ceremony ended, people approached him, congratulating him and asking questions, eager to learn more about Neighbors in Need. It was overwhelming, but Darius took the time to speak to each person, hoping that every conversation would spark another ripple of kindness. A few weeks after the ceremony, Darius was invited to attend a town council meeting. He assumed it would be routine, another update on the program's progress, or perhaps discussions about expanding the program's budget. But as he entered the meeting room, he noticed a plaque on the council table, freshly polished and bearing the familiar logo of Neighbors in Need. Councilman Gregor stood, smiling as he lifted the plaque. "Darius, we've decided to name a park in your honor, a place dedicated to community service and care. It's something the town council has been discussing for a while now, and we all agree that Neighbors in Need deserves a permanent space in Copper Hill." Darius felt his throat tighten with emotion as Gregor handed him the plaque. "The Darius Durant Community Garden and Park will serve as a reminder of what you've accomplished. It will be a place where people can come together, volunteer, and celebrate the spirit of community that you've inspired." The council members applauded, their faces glowing with pride, and Darius felt an overwhelming sense of joy. He thanked them, promising to continue his work with the same dedication that had fueled him since the beginning. As construction on the park began, Darius threw himself into the project, helping design spaces where people could gather, plant flowers, and even grow vegetables that would be donated to the local food bank. The garden became a symbol of Copper Hill's unity, a physical manifestation of the love and connection that had flourished through Neighbors in Need. The park's grand opening was a celebration that drew people from every corner of Copper Hill. Families brought picnic blankets, local bands played cheerful tunes, and children darted around the newly built playground, their laughter filling the air. Darius stood back, watching as people mingled, their smiles and conversations flowing easily. It was a day he knew he would never forget. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Mrs. Thompson approached him, leaning on her cane but standing tall, her face full of warmth and gratitude. "Darius," she began, her voice steady and clear, "you've done something here that goes beyond kindness. You've changed lives, mine, and so many others. You didn't just help me. You helped everyone in this town to see one another, to care for one another. That's a rare gift." Darius looked at her, his eyes misting as he took in her words. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mrs. Thompson. You were the spark that started all of this." They stood together, watching the people of Copper Hill enjoy the park, their voices a harmonious blend of laughter and conversation. It was a sight that filled him with profound gratitude. He had been given the chance to make a difference, to bring people together, and to leave a legacy of kindness that would carry on long after him. As the evening continued, Mavi joined them, along with other members of Neighbors in Need. They shared stories, laughter, and a quiet understanding that they were part of something beautiful, an enduring spirit of compassion and unity that had changed Copper Hill forever. Years later, as generations grew up visiting the Darius Durant Community Garden and Park, the townspeople continued to tell the story of how one observant, caring mailman had transformed their community. And every year on the anniversary of the park's opening, they gathered in that same garden to celebrate, to share stories, and to recommit themselves to the simple yet powerful act of caring for one another. For Darius, this legacy of kindness was more than he had ever imagined, a testament to the idea that one person, with a little courage and a lot of heart, could indeed change the world. And as he walked through the garden on those quiet mornings, now retired but still very much a part of Copper Hill's spirit, he knew that every flower, every laughter-filled day, and every act of kindness was a piece of that legacy, a promise that Copper Hill would always be a place where people cared deeply for one another. A new generation of neighbors in need. Darius had transitioned into retirement with a sense of peace, though he never truly left behind the role he'd embraced in Copper Hill. Even without his postal route or the day-to-day responsibilities of running Neighbors in Need, he remained a beloved figure in town, with people often stopping him on the street just to thank him or ask about the early days of the program. Time, however, brought change. Many of the elderly residents he had once looked after were no longer around, but their stories and the impact of Neighbors in Need lived on, woven into the lives of every family in Copper Hill. One breezy afternoon, as Darius strolled through the Darius Durant Community Garden and Park, he noticed something that filled him with both nostalgia and hope. A group of teenagers gathered around one of the benches, laughing and chatting as they planned an event for the Young Neighbors Club, a youth extension of Neighbors in Need that had recently been formed by high school students. The club was the brainchild of local teachers, inspired by Darius's legacy, and was designed to instill a sense of community responsibility in the younger generation. Curious, Darius wandered closer, listening as the students discussed plans for an upcoming intergenerational event they were organizing at the community center. The idea was simple but powerful. They would invite senior residents to share stories from their lives, giving the youth a glimpse into the past while also connecting them to their present-day community. They called it Stories of Copper Hill, and the enthusiasm in their voices reminded Darius of his younger self, driven by a desire to make a difference. As he continued his walk through the garden, Darius felt the weight of age on his bones, but his spirit was buoyed by the sights and sounds around him. He noticed new flowers planted by community members, each one labeled with a small plaque bearing the name of a volunteer. The garden had grown into more than a place for plants. It was a living record of the kindness and dedication that defined Copper Hill. Flowers bloomed as tributes to the town's beloved residents, marking each life touched by compassion and connection. Lost in thought, Darius was startled when he heard a familiar voice call out to him, "Mr. Durant, wait up." Turning, he saw a young woman hurrying towards him, with a bright smile and a notebook in hand. She was around 16, with curly hair pulled back and an air of determination that reminded him of Maddie, the retired nurse who had been so instrumental in helping establish Neighbors in Need all those years ago. "You're one of the founders of Neighbors in Need, right?" she asked, her eyes wide with admiration. "I'm Emma, the president of the Young Neighbors Club, and I've been wanting to meet you for ages." Darius chuckled, humbled by her enthusiasm. "That's me, Emma. Though I didn't do it alone. Copper Hill made Neighbors in Need what it is today. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Emma's gaze was unwavering, full of respect and awe. "Still, none of us would be here without you. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak at our Stories of Copper Hill event. We'd love to hear how everything started, straight from the source. Darius considered her request, feeling a familiar spark of purpose reignite within him. "I'd be honored, Emma," he replied, nodding. "It's important for people to remember where this all began, especially if it helps carry the spirit of community forward." The day of the event arrived swiftly, and the community center was abuzz with excitement. Chairs filled quickly, occupied by families, teenagers, and elderly residents, all eager to share in the stories that bound them together. At the center of the room sat a panel of Copper Hill's senior residents, each prepared to share tales of their youth, moments of triumph, and lessons learned over decades. Darius took his place among them, feeling the gravity of his role in the day's proceedings. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat, looking out over the audience, his eyes landing on Emma and the other teens in the front row, their faces attentive and eager. "Years ago," he began, "I was just a mailman on a regular route. But one day, I stopped by a house that seemed different. That small decision to knock on a door led to Neighbors in Need, a program that has connected us all in ways I never imagined possible." He shared the story of Mrs. Thompson, the spark that had ignited everything, and the audience listened with rapt attention, hanging on his every word. He spoke of the challenges, the fears he had overcome, and the lessons he learned about community and compassion. "Neighbors in Need showed me that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is simply care, genuinely, deeply care, for the people around you. It's easy to assume that someone else will step in, that someone else will notice, but each of us has the power to make a difference if we're willing to pay attention." As he finished speaking, the room filled with applause, and Darius felt the familiar warmth of pride, not for himself, but for the community that had grown from one act of kindness. Emma approached him after the event, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you so much, Mr. Durant," she said softly. "Hearing your story reminds us that we can make a difference too. We want to keep Neighbors in Need alive for years to come, so that Copper Hill will always be a place where people look out for one another." Darius smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I have no doubt you will, Emma. You and your friends are the future of Copper Hill. Carry this legacy forward and make it your own." The Young Neighbors Club quickly became a force in the town, organizing events, checking on elderly residents, and developing new ways to give back. They expanded the scope of Neighbors in Need, reaching out to neighboring communities, and even creating a mentorship program where younger volunteers paired with senior residents, learning valuable life skills and forging deep, meaningful connections. As the years rolled by, Darius became less active in the day-to-day affairs of Neighbors in Need, but he watched with pride as the program continued to thrive, evolving with each generation. Emma went on to study community development and later returned to Copper Hill to lead the program herself, bringing fresh ideas while honoring the foundation Darius had built. One day, on a bright spring afternoon, Darius found himself back at the garden, now well into his twilight years. He moved slowly, a cane in hand, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. He paused by the flower beds, where vibrant colors filled the air with the sweet scent of new growth. Each flower was marked by small plaques, etched with the names of volunteers and community members who had contributed to the garden over the years. A plaque bearing his own name caught his eye, set among a patch of wildflowers that had flourished unexpectedly. The words were simple, but they brought a lump to his throat. "Darius Durant, for the love of Copper Hill." As he stood there, taking it all in, he felt a presence at his side. Looking over, he saw Emma, now grown and leading the program he had once nurtured. She smiled at him, her eyes full of the same admiration and respect he had seen in her years ago. "Everything here is because of you, Mr. Durant," she said softly. "We're all just adding to the legacy you began." Darius shook his head, a soft smile on his face. "It's not mine alone, Emma. Neighbors in Need belongs to all of us. It's a gift we give to each other every day." They stood in silence for a while, watching the children play in the garden, the elderly residents chatting on the benches, and families sharing laughter. Copper Hill was alive with connection, a place where generations came together, bound by the love and kindness that had taken root all those years ago. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Darius felt a deep, abiding peace. He knew that he had given his community something lasting, something that would carry on long after he was gone. And as he and Emma shared that quiet moment, he felt certain that Copper Hill's legacy of compassion and care would flourish for generations to come.